The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're so glad that you're here with us. We're very excited about the content and the topic that we're going to be covering today. This is Alice Ann Bailey. I'm the Director of Go Alliance at SREB. And if this is your first webinar or event that you've ever attended with SREB, just really quickly, I wanted to go over a little bit about the organization itself and what we do. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. And you'll see if you start with the Analyze and Publish up top, we do a lot of collecting of data around K-12 and all the way up. We focus on anywhere from pre-K up to helping students complete a PhD program. So, you know, we're very comprehensive in the education focus. We collect a lot of data on this and then use it in our work with policymakers, such as governors and their staff, state legislators, institution leaders, and those that work at state education agencies to help them better understand an issue and think through and understand, you know, what's working and what's not in terms of policy and practice. We do a lot of convening and engaging of these leaders in order to help replicate good practice where we see it working, to share information and allow states to share information across state lines. And then we do a lot of direct support as well, beyond just working with you know, state policymakers and agencies, leaders, where we support students and schools directly. And one example of how SREB works is the Go Alliance program that I direct. We focus on helping students who would be the first in their family to complete a post-secondary credential of some kind. And that could be anywhere from an industry certificate, a technical college diploma, an associate's degree, and on up. We, again, you know, work with state agencies and policymakers to help them better understand the issues of what first in the family, low income, students of color, the barriers that they face as they are trying to move through that education pipeline to complete a credential, and help work with them to establish effective policies so that nothing, you know, gets in that, so in order to kind of remove those barriers that we find. We work at the state level to establish and support hand-holding and support programs to help students to plan and apply for post-secondary, and then help them complete a credential once they're there. And we do a lot of communications and outreach directly to students and families so that they have the right information that they need to complete a post-secondary credential and to help make good informed decisions about what's the right match and fit for them in terms of the type of post-secondary institution, the type of post-secondary credential they might want to seek, and in terms of making good, you know, financial fit decisions as well, and which really helps us understand, you know, how this relates to the webinar today that we're going to be talking about. I'm very excited to present to you our three professionals from the Education Trust. Today we have Tiffany Jones with us, and she is the Senior Director of Higher Education Policy at Ed Trust, where she promotes legislation at the state and federal level to improve access, affordability, and success for low-income and students of color. We also have Victoria Jackson, who's a Senior Policy Analyst for Higher Ed at Ed Trust, where she focuses on college affordability and student debt. She is leading Ed Trust's national study on Black student loan debt, which is conducting surveys and interviews to better understand the voices and perspectives of Black borrowers and what they're experiencing and the barriers that get in their way. Then we also have Jaime Ramirez-Mendoza, who is a higher ed policy analyst at Ed Trust, where he collaborates with partners and experts to advance equitable policies around affordability and student debt, again, at the federal, state, and institutional level. And he also works with the National Study on Black Student Debt Project. So we're pleased to have our presenters today. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to let you know a few things. We are recording this webinar today, and it will be placed on the SREB website for you to go back and review at any time. We'll also be posting the slides from Ed Trust on the SREB website, so you can go back and review those as well and share them with your colleagues who were not able to join us today. Also, there will be time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions as our presenters are speaking, feel free to go ahead and start typing in the question box at any time. And that way we can make sure your question gets answered and you don't forget maybe to ask it at the end if something just strikes you as we're going. But we will have time for you to type in your questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. And let me see, let's see. All right, there we go.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for having us. Tiffany Jones, and as said, I lead the higher ed policy work at the Education Trust. And right now I would like to just get us started by giving a quick overview of today's conversation. We can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So we're going to get started by talking about college affordability overall. Then we'll have a specific conversation about the disproportionate impact of some of the challenges around college affordability that impacts most students today, how that uniquely impacts Black students and eventually those who will end up becoming Black student loan borrowers. And we'll also talk about kind of why that is. Why is there a unique experience that Black students are having? What are some of the other systems and policies that contribute to these experiences? And then we're going to talk about policy recommendations. And throughout the conversation today, we are going to have a number of opportunities to be interactive, to hear from you through the polling mechanism my colleagues will use. And even during the policy recommendations, we want to hear from you in terms of what you think is missing that we should be paying attention to, what your reactions are to the types of policy conversations that are happening right now in DC. And so with further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague Jaime to get us started to talk about college affordability overall. So, Jaime, please take it away.
Yes, Tiffany. So as she mentioned, the first thing we're going to go over is college affordability. Over the last several decades, there have been large increases in cost to attend college. For example, at the public four-year institutions between 1889 and 2020, on average, tuition and fees, room and board have more than doubled from around $9,700 to nearly $22,000. This increase is also seen at the public two-year sector, just at a smaller scale. Between 1999 and 2020, the average tuition fees, room and board increased from $10,300 to a little over $12,700. However, one must keep in mind that tuition is only 20% of the cost for students staying off campus at the public two-year sector. And oftentimes at the community college level, tuition is not the main issue for students. It's the non-tuition costs that they cannot afford, such as housing, books, childcare, and transportation costs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we continue, we actually have our first polling question. Alice, can you put the Pell Grant polling question up, please? Perfect. So our question is, in 1975, the Pell Grant covers 79% of the cost of college at a public four-year university. How much did it cover in 2019, 2020? So we'll give you all about 20 seconds to respond, and then the results should show up. Perfect. Alice, can you display the results, please? Okay. So the majority of y'all chose answer B, which is 28%. And that's correct. So in 1975, the maximum Pell Grant covers 79% of the cost of college at a public university, but now it only covers 28%. Next slide, please. As our polling question suggests, another reason college has become unaffordable is that financial aid is not keeping up with the increases in cost. One example of that is the Pell Grant, and this extreme decline of its purchasing power coincided with an increase in enrollment among Black students. And as that was all happening, institutions are providing less need-based aid to students who needed it the most. For example, a New America study found that between 2001 and 2017, public four-year institutions spent nearly $32 billion on students who lacked financial need. In other words, about 2 out of every $5 that these institutions provided went to non-needy students. Next slide. The combination of increases in cost of college, diminishing purchasing power of the Pell Grant, and less allocation to need-based aid has put the burden of cost on students. This was seen in our Ed Trust affordability report that focused on low-income students. The report used the term affordability gap, which is the amount students owe after grants, scholarships, and earnings from working 10 hours a week at the state's minimum wage is applied. Using this affordability gap, our analysis found that even after aid and working, public colleges were still unaffordable for students. For example, at the public four-year institutions, students still owed, on average, a little more than $6,500, which translates to them needing to work 26 hours a week to make up the difference. At the public two-year sector, students on average still owed slightly more than $2,600, which translates to them needing to work 16 hours a week to make up the difference. When you consider the fact that working more than 15 hours per week can slow students' progress towards a college degree, these numbers become even more troubling, as students not only struggle to pay for college, but will most likely need to sacrifice part of their academic performance in order to work to try to cover the cost. And Alice, can you go back a couple of slides, please?
I'm so sorry. Hold on.
No, it's okay.
I don't know what I did. Okay.
There we go. So hopefully by now we provided some solid factors as to why the cost of college has skyrocketed. And while college is becoming unaffordable for all students, this is especially true for Black students. For example, the decline in Pell Grant has a disproportionate impact because nearly 6 out of every 10 undergraduate Black students are recipients. And when looking at the average net price, which is tuition and fees, room and board, and books and supplies, minus average aid received by the student, the total average net price comprised 40% or more of the median household income for Black families in 17 different states. In addition, a disproportionate amount of Black students attend less selective community colleges and public four-year institutions, who, due to public policy decisions, receive less funding. This results in Black students having less access to resources necessary to complete their degrees. All of these factors contribute to Black students borrowing more than any other race and ethnic group. And unfortunately, borrowing more is just the tip of the iceberg of how student debt has become a crisis for Black borrowers. And to get a better sense of the impacts of borrowing while Black, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Victoria.
Hello, thank you for joining us. So as my colleague Jaime mentioned, Black students are more likely to borrow and borrow more than any other racial and ethnic group. And as you can see on this slide, when we look at borrowers who received their associate's degree in 2015-2016, 67% of Black degree recipients borrowed an average of over $22,000, and for bachelor's degree recipients, 86% of Black recipients borrowed an average of 34%. And when we break out that all degree recipients category, what we also find again is that Black borrowers have the highest rates in those categories, as well as any other ethnic and racial group. Next slide, please. So we have a poll question about paying down debt. And Alice, could you please go to the poll question? Thank you. So true or false, A study found that after 12 years, Black borrowers were able to pay down a portion of their federal student loans. Looks like most people went with false on this one. And if we could go back to the PowerPoint in the next slide, please. So those of you who went with false are correct. For students who began their education in the 2003-2004 academic year, after 12 years, only 20 of those 20% had paid down debt. They'd paid down 20% of their debt. And when we look at Black women, they have the largest increase in their balance. So they owe 13% more than their original balance due to accruing interest. Black men owe 11% more due to accruing interest. White men were able to pay down 44% of their debt, and white women were able to pay down 28% of the original balance that they owed. Next slide, please. And so in addition to borrowing more, Black students are more likely to struggle more with repayment. And the worst repayment outcome that a student can have is default. And for federal student loans, default occurs after a borrower hasn't made payments for at least 9 months. And the consequences of defaulting can be catastrophic for a person's financial health. It ruins their credit, their ability to potentially get an apartment, buy a house, buy a car, or get a job. And also people can have their wages garnished, their tax refunds garnished, and also Social Security payments garnished. And so when we look at the percentage of people who are defaulting within 12 years, again, from this 2003-2004 cohort, we see that for Black people, it's about 50% are defaulting over that time period. So 50% of Black borrowers are experiencing these negative financial outcomes compared to 28% of people overall. And so there are also other factors that make someone more likely to be in a position of default in addition to being Black. One of those is not completing your degree. And that's understandable because you've taken on debt, but you don't have the earnings boost from getting the degree. And then also for people who attend for-profit institutions, they also have higher rates of default. And that's largely because of the many for-profit institutions engage in predatory behavior and have worse outcomes than comparable public institutions, and often cost more and require people to go into much more debt to attend them. And so when you put all of those factors together, what we see is a Black student who attended a for-profit institution who doesn't complete their degree, 3 in 4 of those students default. And even when we think about not attending a for-profit and completing your degree, something we know protects people from default, Black college graduates have a higher default rate than white college dropouts. Next slide, please. And so when we look, this graph on this side shows 12-year default rates for dependent, full-time, first-time students at 4-year colleges. And these are what we describe as like a traditional college student, someone going to school sort of right after high school. Their parents might be helping them out. They're going full-time, and this is their first time entering college. And what we see from this graph when we look at default rates are Black borrowers in the highest income quartile have default rates that are nearly 7 times as high as their high-income white peers. And it's even higher than their lowest income white peers. And so when we think about things that are like protective factors, like completing your degree, not attending a for-profit institution, or coming from a high-income family, those things are not shielding Black people from having the most negative consequences with debt, which is default. And we'll talk about some of the structural reasons for why that's happening later. Next slide, please. And so when we look overall, and we look at race and gender, what we find is that Black women have the worst outcomes with student debt. And it's for all of these reasons that are listed on this slide. And sort of all of these things combined together result in a study by the American Association of University Women finding that 57% of Black women struggle with affording essential expenses like rent and food because of their student loans. Next slide, please. So here's this quote that really gets to the point about this is a crisis for Black students, and that even when Black students do those things that we consider like the right things to do, completing your degree and, you know, being privileged, like coming from a high-income family, are still struggling with debt at higher levels than other groups. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the structural reasons of why Black students are disproportionately affected by student debt. Next slide, please. So employment discrimination prevents Black borrowers from getting the same return on their investment as white borrowers. Consistently, we find that Black people have unemployment rates that are about double the rate of white people. And that's in large part because of this discrimination that we've listed, you know, fewer opportunities, lower pay, benefits, and then discrimination within the hiring process. So we have an example of, you know, the resumes using a white sounding name or a Black sounding name, and the white sounding name on an identical resume to a resume with the Black sounding name is the equivalent of 8 years of experience. So you can imagine what that means for your ability to get a job and what that means for pay, and then your ability to repay your loans. And as we talked about, Black women struggle the most with student debt when we look at race and gender, and that's because they're experiencing that double gap. They're experiencing a racial wage gap, and they're experiencing a gender pay gap. And so we see here on this slide that Black women have lost over $50 billion in wages because of gender and racial discrimination. The next slide, please. And so when we talk about discrimination in employment, that drives the racial wage gap, but there's also a racial wealth gap, which is much larger than the wage gap. And the racial wealth gap shows these sort of accumulated effects of centuries of oppression. So slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, which is housing discrimination, and also other forms of discrimination and other types of lending. And of course, employment discrimination contributes to that. And this slide provides you with information about housing discrimination. During the 20th century, wealth generated from home ownership was one of the biggest and most important ways that middle class and working class white families were able to build wealth. And because federal policies like redlining, Black families were kept out of the subsidized federal home loans and kept out of neighborhoods that allowed people to build wealth. And so what that resulted in now is that individual Black families have not built wealth, in some cases been trapped in predatory land contracts that stripped wealth. So we're not able to build wealth from home ownership. And then the neighborhoods that Black people living in have less resources and less wealth. And then, of course, has ripple effects throughout other areas. And so we see here, when we think about student debt, we have majority Black zip codes have high loan balances and high default rates than majority white neighborhoods.
Victoria, we're actually having trouble hearing you. I think your bandwidth can't handle having your webcam on. Can you try turning off your webcam and see if that helps?
So our next slide should be a polling. Sorry about that. Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah.
Hear me now? Okay. So we have our polling questions on the wealth gap. And if Alice, you go to the polling question, please. Yeah. Thank you. So true or false, white households that are headed by a person with a high school diploma or less have more wealth than black households headed by someone with a bachelor's degree or higher. Okay. Overwhelming response for the answer to be true, and that is correct. Next slide, please. So when we look at the racial income gap, we see it's quite large, but not as great as the racial wealth gap. And white households at the median, so the typical white household has nearly 10 times as much wealth as the typical black household. And so we're looking at in 2016, the typical white household had about a little over $171,000 in wealth compared to only a little over $17,000 for the typical black family. And yes, white families that have less than a high school diploma or a high school diploma do have quite a bit more wealth than black families with a bachelor's degree or higher. And so when we were talking about redlining, I mentioned that it has an impact on home values and the resources available to majority black neighborhoods. And this, of course, has an effect on inequitable education funding. And so we know that black students and non-white students overall are attending districts that receive $23 billion less than white districts, even though they were serving the same number of students. And that's because we have a K-12 education system that's largely funded on property tax, which of course, if home values are depressed in your area because of racist federal housing policy, that then of course affects the available resources for students attending those schools. And because black students are concentrated at under-resourced K-12 schools, they're less likely to have the college prep coursework and other supports that help people graduate and go on to higher education, but particularly be able to attend selective higher education. And then when we look at higher education, public higher ed, we see these inequities continue. So policies and practices are disproportionately leading to black students attending less selective colleges. Even when they have scores on SATs and GPA scores that are at the level of a selective institution, black students are still more likely to attend a less selective institution, which are more likely to have fewer resources to help students complete their degrees and then move on to a career. And there's actually research that found that spending is about $1,000 less on black Latinx students than their white peers. And that results in $5 billion less annually in higher education spending for black students compared to white students. And then for the polling question. Black students make up 13% of all undergrads at public institutions. What percent do black students make up at for-profit institutions? Most people went with 35%. Next slide, please. And so the answer to that polling question was that black students represent 29% of for-profit institution students. And so there's a disproportionately high representation there. And what that means is that black students are more likely to attend institutions that have a track record of engaging in predatory behavior and engaging in behavior that makes it more difficult for students to succeed afterwards. For example, there is evidence that shows that students attending for-profit institutions, for example, say it's from some type of medical field profession, they go take the course in the profession and they never actually get the in-the-field training that's required to move on to the next level to actually get your state licensure. And so that's sort of the predatory practices that we're talking about, inflating career numbers and job placement rates, etc. So this slide details some more of the realities of Black students at for-profit institutions. Next slide, please. And so when we look at federal higher education policy and whether or not it is protecting all students from predatory institutions, what we're seeing is that there's been a rollback of protections. And so there have been rules like the gainful employment rule, which protected students from programs that did not provide sufficient economic returns. That has been rolled back and repealed. Borrower defense was a rule that provided debt cancellation for students that had been, it had been proven that their institution had defrauded them, like Corinthian college students. You've probably heard about those students in the news. And so that's one way that the federal policy has not helped and protected students. And then additionally, when we look at making sure that college is affordable, as Jaime mentioned, Pell Grants have not kept up with the rising cost of college. And so we now know that Pell Grants are only covering 28% of the full cost of attending a public four-year institution. And then income-driven repayment plans, which are sort of the real only federal solution we have to addressing the student debt crisis, often leaves people with unaffordable payments, monthly payments still. And there's sort of this web of payment plans that students have to navigate that can often be quite difficult, particularly with students interacting with loan servicers and their ability to get accurate and timely information from them. Next slide, please. And so this is just a graphic showing how all of these things that we've talked about, employment discrimination, inequitable K-12 and higher ed funding, the racial income and wage gap, failed federal policies, overrepresentation at for-profit colleges, and housing discrimination all contribute to the Black student debt crisis. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Tiffany Jones, and she is going to talk about what we can do. What are the next steps? Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. And so that we have plenty of time for questions and responding to the areas that you all are most interested in, I'm actually just going to walk through some of the policy recommendations that we recommend and are aligned with some of the policy conversations happening here in DC and also at the state levels as well. And so first and foremost, a lot of the efforts that we put into our advocacy work and our partners as well is focused on trying to eliminate the need for students to have to borrow in the first place and not just trying to fix the debt that they have. And so that means making sure that there are resources available to students from families who can't pay. You know, Jaime already talked about the Pell Grant and its purchasing power diminishing over time. Right now, there's a number of advocacy organizations, including the Education Trust, NCAN, that's the National Network, and many others right now calling for doubling the Pell Grant. And the reason for that is doing so would allow the Pell Grant to cover at least half of the full cost of attendance at a public four-year college. For example, again, about 2/3 of Black students qualify for the Pell Grant, and doing so can have a tremendous impact on the ability of Black students to pay for college without having to take on debt. So there's also thinking about this idea of debt cancellation. So what do you do about those who have debt right now, even if you try to address their need to borrow up front? And many folks are calling for some sort of debt cancellation. And that is a very complex policy recommendation in that some are calling for $10,000 of forgiveness for everyone. Others have called for upwards of $50,000 in forgiveness for students from families falling below a particular income threshold. Some have called for forgiving all debts of all kinds, including private loans as well as public loans. What is probably most likely to happen first is a forgiveness for a broad group of students of a smaller amount, as we've seen a number of members of Congress kind of rally around the idea of $10,000 over the last few months, and it's some possibility, it's been proposed that this could be included in some sort of stimulus bill over the next year, but we just have no way of knowing if that will be the case. What we are proposing is that as these conversations continue and continue to evolve around like debt cancellation, is just making sure to keep equity in mind. And so again, if the average Black borrower has around $30,000 in debt, just being cognizant of the significance of $10,000 of forgiveness, which I assume would be very helpful for a number of students and families, but wouldn't necessarily eliminate the student debt problem for Black students in particular. And again, there's also those who argue against any form of debt cancellation because of the concern that it would provide some sort of benefit to people they assume are already privileged or better off because they've had college opportunity. And our intent here with today's information and discussion is just to demonstrate that it's not necessarily the case. Within this very diverse group of borrowers, our students, in particular Black students, who are having a unique crisis. And so actually thinking about how to do some sort of debt cancellation could be an equity focused policy solution. There's also a number of repayment plans, and we don't have time to really have a lengthy discussion about decipher those, but some of the biggest problems that have come up for students include those related to the servicing they get. And by servicing, this means if you have a question about your repayment plan and you call the number that you're supposed to, you get one piece of information, and you might call back next week and you might get a different piece of information. The result are students who qualify for particular programs, for example, the public service loan forgiveness programs, with the majority of those who were under the impression that they would qualify. When the time comes, they've been rejected in terms of their forgiveness because of some of the logistics around filling out the correct paperwork or like details. And so the processes and the servicing of the existing repayment programs have to be improved. They have to be simplified. And then there's also the concern about the length of time and its impact on students' individual financial well-being as well as the overall economic well-being of the nation. So if you have students who are still going to be indebted for 20 plus years, is that the most helpful approach for addressing the student debt crisis? Also, there's a number of things, a lot of what I've discussed is actions that the federal government could take, are talking about, also things that states can do. And we've seen examples of this. For example, some states have passed legislation that includes Borrower Bill of Rights, which includes some stronger consumer protections for borrowers of all backgrounds to make sure that they're protected against, again, predatory lending and predatory colleges, and to make sure that there's better transparency and the like, and things that are in the best interest of borrowers so that they have full awareness of the agreements they're getting into and protections as they embark on their repayment journey. There's also some states, they have the ability, if they have actually given out loans to students, to pause those payments during this current time of economic crisis, the same way the federal government has put a pause on federal loan payments until October at least, but definitely recommend throughout the duration of the economic crisis caused by the current pandemic. There's also important, and I'll just kind of use this as a great example of where states have really stepped up, where the federal government hasn't necessarily fulfilled the responsibility to protect students from predatory colleges overall. A number of states have gone as far as, of course, state attorney generals suing on behalf of borrowers when there have been predatory colleges that have taken advantage of students, misled students, were fraudulent within their states. Again, that is a really aggressive or active role from states, but it definitely shows some leadership that they're trying to operate in the best interest of student loan borrowers. The other thing states can do, again, on this piece around having to borrow in the first place, as it was discussed, a lot of the colleges that Black students attend get fewer dollars than the colleges white students attend, and there's a long history of that. And so states can be thoughtful when they think about how to distribute the resources they have, and we do understand this is a time of economic crisis. States are having to do just as much, if not more, with perhaps fewer dollars. And so it's actually more important than ever to think about how to prioritize those resources. So that means thinking about investing in the colleges that have more students who've perhaps been impacted by unemployment, like the community colleges, and not necessarily spending, you know, in some states like they do almost 3 times as much per student on state flagships or other students' resources in the first place. It also might mean prioritizing the type of aid programs that go out. So for example, if all aid can't be fully funded because the budget is just not there, that might mean fully funding need-based aid programs, but not necessarily merit-based aid programs. And we say that because in many states, they define merit as based on things like standardized test scores, which are highly correlated with income, which ends up state dollars going to families who could already afford to pay for college. And so again, it's up to states whether to continue those programs, but if they're in a moment of economic crisis where they have to make really tough choices, it's more important to make sure that they're providing resources to students from families who cannot pay, especially during this time of economic crisis, reduce the likelihood that those students would have to borrow in the first place. So I'm going to stop. I think now is the time for us to turn over and to the question and answer portion of the conversation. I believe you have a questions function where you can submit any questions you might have for myself, Victoria, or Jaime will jump in there and answer to the best of our ability. Feel free to please think of your questions and add them now. While you're thinking of those questions and submitting them, I do want to highlight that there's still a lot to learn about the impact of the Black student debt crisis. And so the Education Trust is doing a national study to learn more about those experiences Black borrowers are having so that we can make sure that we're pushing for policy solutions that are helpful. And so that involves a national survey as well as and so again, if you feel free to share the information about the survey as well, if you go to edtrust.org/Black student debt study, there again you can participate, you can share, and we appreciate any participation you're able to help with. And do we have any questions that have come in that we can respond?
Yes, we do. And the first question is a two-parter about for-profit institutions. One attendee would like an explanation, I guess, of the difference between a nonprofit institution, which can be public or private, and a for-profit institution, which are always private. What is the difference? Can you clarify?
Sure, I'm happy to start off, and then Victoria, if you want to jump in at all, if there's anything I've left out, feel free. I can just start by saying whether a college is for-profit or nonprofit is reflective of their tax status. It reflects some differences in their governance structure. One of the main differences that matters most to college affordability and student success is they do have shareholders, for example, where when you think about how resources are used, one of the biggest differences or distinguishing factors between a nonprofit college and a for-profit college is usually the percent of all the resources that they accumulate through tuition that students pay and other resources are that those resources, they spend a much smaller percentage of their resources on instruction, related things, and more so they do have, again, they pay out their shareholders. For example, they spend a lot more money one of the biggest buckets of money on marketing to increase their enrollment. And again, when you look at one of the distinguishing factors, and I'm sticking here because folks can change their tax status from for-profit to nonprofit and still operate with some of the same traits. But again, one of those distinguishing factors is that most of the spending will not be on instructional related educational activities for students, but more so on marketing or paying out their shareholders. Victoria, is there anything you would add to that?
This is Alice Ann. I would just add a little bit more of an explanation that basically a for-profit institution is run like a business, and its main purpose is to earn money and earn a profit to pay its shareholders and then, the business owners. A nonprofit institution, which can be public or private, merely takes the tuition revenue that it collects and uses that to invest back in the institution itself and provide services to its students, but it's not making a profit. It's making just enough to sustain its operations. So it has a difference in terms of how the accounting is done and reviewed by the IRS. Does that make sense, everyone? Anything you would add? I jumped in there. Sorry. Anything you would add, Victoria?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
The other part of that question is, why do you see more Blacks attending for-profit institutions than whites? Why is there such a higher percentage?
Victoria, you want to jump in that one first?
Sure. So for-profit institutions, Tiffany mentioned that they do a lot of marketing and they particularly target particular groups of students, and Black students are some of those groups. And they also target low-income students, they target veterans, they target single mothers, really anyone who is, generally speaking, sort of like this idea of someone who's harmed by the economy, who's trying to get a leg up, trying to reskill. They target those people in particular because low-income people, veterans, receive federal funding to go to school, like through the Pell Grant or through the GI Bill. And so those institutions are often looking to bring in that money, and then they use it again to create profit for their shareholders and whoever else. And then they like to bring in that group of students. So there's direct targeting. Also, some of the structure of a for-profit institution, they have that rolling admissions. You can enroll almost, every month, as opposed to just having to apply to enroll for the fall and spring semester. So some of the flexibility, some of the job training programs that they provide, or some of it meets the needs of certain people in our economy. And those people tend to be more low-income people. They tend to particularly target and locate in Black neighborhoods and target veterans, etc. So that would be my reasoning. And Tiffany, please feel free to expand.
Sure. And I would just add to that, the nonprofit higher education has often not aggressively targeted and recruited these same groups of students. And I'm generalizing, of course, but this is also an example, again, where Jaime talked about merit aid programs increasing at public universities, and all these recruitment tactics not necessarily being targeted at the same groups of potential students that for-profits are targeting. So it's, yes, for-profits have aggressively targeted and recruited, but also nonprofit higher ed historically has not necessarily recruited these particular groups of students in the same way, nor structured their educational offerings to fit the needs of these students in terms of, flexible, what time of day they offer courses, offering courses online, etc.
Okay, our next question asks, thank you, that's a great answer. Our next question asks, if you pay off your student debt, does that lower your credit score?
I'll allow my colleagues to please weigh in. My impression is it depends, and it can have an impact. I would say the biggest impact around student debt and your credit score is just making sure you make on-time payments, because if you default on your student loans, that has a very negative impact on your credit score. So one thing it would do is not put you in danger of default any longer. Student loan debt also can be counted in your total when you're figuring out your debt to earnings ratio. My impression is, some have given the advice that, student debt doesn't really hurt you because it's very understandable debt, it's responsible debt, but it's still debt that shows up on your credit report. So let me pause there and see if Jaime or Victoria have anything they would add to that response.
Yeah, I agree with Tiffany, and I know people will talk about this, and I think sometimes it's because of people's, you factored into your credit score is also your longest line of credit, but the impact of no longer having a long line of credit on your report is definitely nowhere near going to be as bad as defaulting or continuing to show that you have a large amount of debt compared to your income. So I don't think it's really overall, it depends, and I wouldn't think that the harm is too great for paying off.
Okay. Have you found evidence of Black borrowers, if they're working with a private bank, having higher loan rates than whites in student loans?
Yeah, so there was research that recently came out showing that students attending HBCU, which are historically Black colleges and universities, were given higher interest rates than students attending predominantly white institutions with the same financial profile and sort of the same cost of going to school. And then also discrimination in lending in general. I would imagine that that's happening across the board, Wells Fargo, et cetera, wherever Discover someone may choose to get a private loan.
Thank you. Yes. What is your recommendation to school counselors and college access advisors who are working with students of color in finding the right institution that they're interested in attending, and also making sound financial aid decisions, given everything that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I can take this one. I used to be a college access advisor, as was Jaime, and I think Tiffany might have done it as well too. And so I know for me, I was working in Cleveland Public Schools, and one of the biggest things is my students were heavily recruited by for-profit institutions, asking them to complete the FAFSA on a timeline that did not make sense for their graduation. So presenting them with the information about the cost and outcomes of attending, a for-profit versus our local institution, I also think is best of information you can give in planning. But ultimately, I would say that, financial literacy or making the best decisions and applying for scholarships are individual solutions to a structural problem, and that we really have to address these issues at the policy level, at the federal and state level, because really this is something that people are not going to, be able to navigate their way out of. But of course, being as informed as possible, providing them with information, helping people understand award letters is critical.
Very true. That's a great answer. You have a slide about Black graduates in the higher AGI defaulting on loans more than their white counterparts in the same bracket. Do you know what the average student loan debt is between the two groups?
I don't have that information from that slide about what their average amount borrowed is, but given our other information about average amount borrowed, we do know that Black students at all income levels borrow more than white students at all income levels. So presumably you could assume that the Black student in each income level is borrowing more than the white group of students.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see if I can make sense of this question. Why did you choose to look at student debt 12 years out?
Oh, so there is data that the federal government collects and reports on, and that is the timeline that that data is reported on. So anyone who does this research on student debt is using that. There's a cohort of students from 2003 to 2004, which is like, I think, the most recent, and then 12 years out is the data that is collected and reported on.
Okay, and here's the next part of that question. Should we increase aid to community colleges? I think, like 2-year institutions. And I think the question, I'm not sure if the question is federal or state, but one of the challenges, they say, has been the extremely low graduation rate at 2-year institutions that is occurring. Because I'm in your judging myself into this question. I would argue it's because they have so little resources available to them to meet the student needs, but that's my opinion. All right, this person says, would increasing the resources at these colleges be enough, or would we be incentivizing more selective institutions to enroll more Black students? Do you understand the question?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say it's a both and. In our recommendations that we push as Ed Trust, those colleges with the greatest resources should be doing a much better job at enrolling low-income students and students of color. In particular, we actually just put out a report this week called Segregation Forever that looks at 101 of the most selective colleges, public colleges across the country, and just demonstrates that they're doing a poor job of enrolling Black and Latino students in particular compared to their representation in the state population. And it matters, again, because those are the institutions that have been given the most resources and have the highest success rates. And so part of the puzzle is those institutions having more students of color so that those students have those opportunities. On the other hand, those colleges who have already been committed to providing those opportunities are more deserving of more investments from states, from the federal government, as well as private resources. And just an example of the relationship between perhaps additional funds and student success overall is you have evidence-based strategies such as the CUNY ASAP program that has been shown to double completion rates for students, but most of the time institutions are not able to continue or start or pilot those types of programs because they don't have the resources. And so even CUNY ASAP, as much as folks refer to that in the field, and it's got some great evidence that shows their success, it's been on the chopping block in this time of budget cuts, as well as even the pilot that happened in Ohio to try to replicate and adapted the model for that context to increase completion at 2-year colleges, and they were able to do that, and it's uncertain that they'll be able to continue because of funding. And in Ohio, it's just a couple $1,000s per student is the cost, so that could be a difference maker. Right now, again, as it's already been presented, there is a funding gap between what's being spent on Black and white students, and that's driven by the difference in what's being spent on the types of colleges Black students attend versus the types of colleges white students attend. So we absolutely believe that there's a strong relationship there, as well as remembering that institutions also would, if they have more resources, they can also help students pay when they're unable to fill those gaps, rather than students always having to take out loans to meet those needs.
And this is Alice, and I just wanted everyone to see if you're not familiar with what we were talking about, the Community ASAP program, it's been incredibly effective with increasing graduation rates by providing higher levels of mentoring and tutoring support, providing many grants to students by helping them with money on their Metro card so they can travel to and from campus, helping students with accessing more open education resources and online books and things like that. But it is costly to implement, and that is the problem that we're facing right now. We know that it's incredibly effective, but it is expensive for an institution to provide. So
I don't know, Jaime, is there anything you would add to that? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Not really. You kind of succinctly described it all. I think the only thing I would add is to a question prior in regards to what college advisors can do to help Black students. And I think two things that come up to my mind is engaging with the parents. and also engaging with the admissions counselors. Because as a first-gen low-income student, I had no idea the hidden curriculum of the college application process, nor the financial resources available to me. So a lot of the times I had to understand it myself, translate the academic English to regular English, and then translate it to Spanish for my parents. So really engaging in that work with parents to have them understand all of their financial opportunities that are available to them, and also connecting with admissions counselors, because oftentimes they would tell me resources and tips and tricks that I didn't know as a student, nor as an advisor. So a lot of that times it was like access to pots of money at that direct institution that I had no idea of. So those would be the two recommendations I would provide.
Excellent. That's a really good point. That is wrapping up our time together today. I would like to thank all our presenters who did such a fabulous job. The amount of resources and statistics and everything that you were bringing to bear were so thorough, it really, really helping to lay out and understand the problem that really has systemic roots in our culture and in our country's history, to really understand how this has become such a crisis for students. Also, I want to let everyone know, embedded within the PowerPoints today were links to further research articles that that will explain that even further. As well as, I want to let everyone know, if you come here and then go to workshops and webinars and click on that tab, you will find where we are going to post the recording from this webinar, the slides, as well as links to Ed Trust for the survey that they're conducting for Black students, as well as the report that they, actually there's two reports that they referenced today. So all of this will be posted on here. So I encourage everyone to come back tomorrow and check for all of that. Thank you, thank you, thank you for everyone's time today. This was incredibly helpful, just a fabulous, fabulous webinar. Thank you, everyone.